There is something many people with an avoidant attachment style quietly hope for after they create distance, yet they rarely say it aloud because even to them, it does not seem to make complete sense. Deep inside, they often hope the other person will respond in a way that feels emotionally familiar, something that resembles the relationship pattern they experienced with their earliest caregiver. To understand why, imagine this situation. During a relationship discussion, someone shared an interesting comparison that completely changed the way many people think about emotional avoidance. They described it as being similar to an allergy. A person with a cat allergy does not choose to sneeze, struggle to breathe, or have watery eyes. Their body reacts automatically. In much the same way, an avoidant person often does not consciously choose to feel overwhelmed when emotional closeness becomes intense. As intimacy grows too quickly, their nervous system may respond with a powerful feeling of pressure, emotional overload, or the urge to escape. Even when nothing dangerous is actually happening, their body interprets closeness as something that requires protection rather than connection. This is why their reaction can seem so confusing. From the outside, it may look like they are making a deliberate decision to pull away. But inside, much of what is happening is automatic. Their nervous system has learned certain emotional patterns over many years, and it reacts before logic has a chance to catch up. Stay with me, because the reason behind this response goes much deeper than most people realize. One important idea from neuroscience helps explain why this happens. The brain becomes stronger at whatever it experiences repeatedly. When certain experiences occur again and again, the brain builds powerful connections around them while paying less attention to experiences that rarely happen. Over time, familiar patterns become the brain's default way of understanding the world. Researchers demonstrated this idea through a well-known experiment involving young kittens raised in highly controlled environments. Some kittens spent their early development surrounded only by vertical stripes. As they grew, their brains adapted so completely to that environment that they later struggled to recognize horizontal movement. Other kittens experienced only horizontal patterns and later had difficulty recognizing vertical shapes. Their brains had not simply observed the world. They had learned to interpret reality based on repeated experience. The lesson is surprisingly powerful. The brain does not only record life, it builds expectations from what it repeatedly encounters. Those expectations eventually shape the way new experiences are interpreted. The same principle quietly influences emotional development. During childhood, the brain learns what closeness, comfort, safety, and relationships are supposed to feel like based on repeated emotional experiences. Long before we consciously understand relationships, our nervous system is already creating a map of them. When this understanding is applied to attachment, many confusing behaviors begin making much more sense. Emotional attachment starts developing very early in life. For many people with avoidant tendencies, early relationships may have included emotional inconsistency. A caregiver might have provided food, shelter, and practical care, while struggling to offer consistent emotional warmth, comfort, or understanding. Sometimes they were emotionally available. Other times they seem distant even while physically present. Gradually, the child's nervous system begins forming quiet conclusions about relationships. Emotional closeness no longer feels completely safe. Depending too much on another person begins to feel risky. Expressing emotional needs may seem less rewarding than hiding them. Little by little, the nervous system adapts. Independence begins feeling safer than reliance. Emotional control feels safer than emotional openness. Distance begins replacing closeness as the strategy for staying emotionally protected. None of this usually happens through conscious choice. It develops slowly through repetition until these patterns begin feeling normal. The child grows into an adult carrying an invisible emotional blueprint that quietly shapes future relationships without fully realizing it. The next part explains why this can create such confusing relationship dynamics later in life. The earliest emotional relationships often become the model the nervous system uses to recognize love. If a caregiver was unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, sometimes emotionally available, and sometimes unreachable, that inconsistency can become woven into the person's understanding of connection itself. Later in life, when an avoidant person creates distance and the other person steps back, something unexpected may happen inside them. Although it appears like rejection from the outside, their nervous system may recognize the emotional pattern because it resembles something deeply familiar from long ago. Familiar does not necessarily mean healthy, it simply means recognizable. The nervous system often prefers what it already knows, even when those experiences created pain. This is why so many relationship dynamics become difficult to understand. One person's withdrawal may feel like abandonment to their partner, while quietly feeling familiar to the avoidant person's emotional system. That familiarity does not mean they enjoy the situation or consciously want it. It simply reflects the emotional patterns their nervous system learned years earlier. Understanding this does not excuse hurtful behavior or remove the importance of healthy communication. Every relationship still requires honesty, mutual respect, accountability, and emotional growth from both people. But recognizing these deeper patterns can help explain why some reactions seem so confusing on the surface. What looks like simple rejection is often connected to emotional habits formed long before the current relationship ever began. And once those hidden patterns become visible, many experiences that once felt impossible to understand begin fitting together in a completely different way. Not because it is healthy or beneficial, but because it matches a familiar emotional pattern their nervous system has known for a very long time. After looking closely at many real stories from people who eventually reconnected with avoidant partners after a breakup, one pattern appeared more consistently than almost anything else. It was not constant texting, emotional pleading, long explanations, or trying to convince the other person to return. The biggest difference came from something much quieter: emotional stability after the breakup. It was a place where the person stopped reacting from fear and panic and started responding from inner balance and self-respect. That shift changes the entire emotional dynamic because it no longer feeds the cycle that existed before. Instead of emotional pressure, it introduces calm. Instead of chasing, it offers quiet confidence. For someone whose emotional system was shaped by inconsistency, that kind of steady presence can feel surprisingly powerful. Imagine someone reaching a point where they honestly tell themselves, if this relationship comes back, that's okay. If it doesn't, I'll still be okay. At that moment, they stand at a crossroads. They can fully move forward with their life or choose to make one final, calm attempt to reconnect without desperation. Suddenly, everything looks different. Perhaps they even begin questioning whether they misunderstood what was happening during the relationship. What if the distance they experienced was not simply emotional indifference? What if something much deeper was influencing those reactions? Stay with me because this next idea changes the way many people understand avoidant behavior. Think about the emotional pattern many avoidant individuals experience. At the beginning of a relationship, everything often feels exciting. They genuinely want closeness. They hope this relationship will be different from the ones before it, but gradually something begins shifting inside them. Emotional expectations start feeling heavier. Small moments of intimacy create unexpected discomfort. They begin thinking about creating space. Little by little, they withdraw until, eventually, they decide to leave. Immediately afterward, there is often a noticeable feeling of relief. It can feel as though a heavy weight has been lifted from their shoulders. They finally feel like they can breathe again. Yet that relief rarely lasts forever. After some time, new emotions quietly begin appearing: loneliness, confusion, doubt. Questions such as, why does this keep happening? Or, why can't I seem to make relationships work? Slowly emerge. What looks like a simple cycle of getting close and pulling away is often something much deeper. Throughout the relationship, they have been moving through emotional territory that feels unfamiliar to their nervous system. For many avoidant individuals, emotional closeness is not the emotional baseline they learned during childhood. Emotional distance is. Their nervous system often interprets deep intimacy as pressure rather than safety. That reaction is rarely a conscious decision. It is an emotional habit built through years of repeated experience. The next piece explains why this pattern can feel so difficult to break. Many of these emotional patterns begin developing very early in life. A child may grow up with a caregiver who is physically present but emotionally inconsistent. Sometimes warmth is available. Sometimes it disappears without explanation. Sometimes comfort arrives. Other times, emotional needs are quietly ignored. Over time, the nervous system creates a simple but powerful belief: independence feels safer than relying on other people. Emotional distance becomes more predictable than emotional closeness. Because of this, when a relationship ends and distance returns, it may not simply feel like freedom. It can feel strangely familiar, not joyful, not necessarily peaceful, but recognizable. It resembles the emotional environment the nervous system learned to survive within years earlier. That familiar emotional state can temporarily create a sense of relief, even though it does not create lasting happiness. Yet another force is operating at the very same time. Human beings are naturally built for emotional connection. Deep inside, every person carries a biological drive to bond with others, seek comfort, and build secure relationships. This creates an internal conflict. One part of the person longs for closeness and genuine connection. Another part has learned that closeness feels emotionally risky. Those two forces quietly pull against one another. From the outside, this contradiction often looks confusing. Inside, however, it feels very real. They may sincerely want love while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by the emotional closeness required to maintain it. Understanding this inner conflict helps explain why their actions sometimes seem to contradict their feelings. Something important changes when the other person reaches genuine emotional acceptance. When someone sincerely says to themselves, "I'll be okay no matter what happens," the emotional pressure begins disappearing. The relationship no longer feels like one person pursuing while the other keeps retreating. Instead, both space and emotional safety begin existing together. That combination can feel surprisingly different for someone whose nervous system has long associated closeness with pressure. Notice the difference carefully. This is not about pretending to move on in order to create a reaction. Real emotional detachment is not a strategy. It is not something performed to make another person return. It is a genuine internal shift toward peace, stability, and self-respect. Reaching that place is much harder than simply understanding it. Many people know logically that avoidant partners often need space. Yet when attachment, fear, and heartbreak become involved, acting on that knowledge becomes far more difficult. Human attention rarely follows logic alone. It follows emotional conditioning. Awareness may come first. Emotional regulation takes longer. Lasting behavioral change usually takes even more time. That is why healing always begins inside, rather than through attempts to control another person's response. The next example reveals just how deeply human beings are wired for emotional connection. One well-known psychological experiment illustrates this perfectly. In the study, a parent sits facing their infant and interacts normally for a short time. Then, without warning, the parent suddenly becomes emotionally unresponsive. No smile, no facial expression, no eye contact, no emotional feedback at all. Within only a few seconds, the baby's behavior begins changing. At first, the child smiles, reaches forward, and makes sounds, trying to restore the emotional connection. When nothing changes, the child becomes increasingly distressed. Confusion grows into frustration, and frustration gradually becomes panic, because the infant depends on emotional responses from the caregiver to feel safe. This reaction is not random. Human beings are born relying on connection. A caregiver's face, tone of voice, and emotional presence help the child understand whether the world is safe and what they themselves are feeling. Modern demonstrations of similar ideas sometimes show parents briefly pretending something frightening has happened in front of their child. Almost immediately, the child looks toward the parent, searching for emotional guidance before deciding how to respond. These moments reveal something deeply human. Long before we learn language, our nervous system learns relationships. It learns where safety lives. It learns how closeness feels. Those early lessons quietly remain with us long into adulthood, shaping how we approach intimacy, distance, trust, and love. Recognizing those patterns does not remove personal responsibility or excuse unhealthy behavior, but it helps explain why changing relationship habits often requires much more than good intentions alone. Real change happens when awareness, emotional healing, and consistent action begin working together over time. Even when nothing has truly happened, the infant may still cry or become upset, not because of physical suffering, but because they are sensing the emotional condition of the caregiver. If the caregiver appears frightened or worried, the child's mind interprets that signal as proof that danger is present. Across both situations, the same pattern appears. The child is constantly observing the caregiver, searching for emotional information. Their nervous system is naturally designed to adjust and respond to those signals, but this is where the common misunderstanding begins. Avoidant individuals are not simply the complete opposite of this emotional system, yet they often seem that way from the outside because instead of showing increased distress when emotional connection feels uncertain, they often appear to disconnect. When emotional intensity rises, or when someone moves closer emotionally, their system usually does not react through obvious escalation. Instead, it often moves backward. It creates distance. This is why the work of Mary Ainsworth and her strange situation experiment became so important. In that research, infants between 12 and 18 months old were observed while their caregiver briefly left the room and later returned. The most meaningful moment was not only the separation itself, but what happened during the reunion. Secure infants became upset when their caregiver left, but they were quickly comforted when the caregiver returned. Anxious infants experience stronger distress and often struggle to calm themselves even after the caregiver came back. Avoidant infants, however, seemed extremely self-sufficient. They showed little crying, did not move toward the caregiver, and appeared emotionally untouched. But the deeper measurements revealed another reality. Their heart rate, stress hormones, and physical responses showed that their bodies were activated beneath the surface. They were not truly relaxed. They were simply hiding their distress. And this is where adult attachment becomes much more complicated because what appears to be emotional coldness is often a learned survival response, not proof that feelings do not exist. It is a pattern created early in life when showing emotions did not consistently lead to comfort, safety, or emotional support. So the system adapts by learning a message. Do not reach out, do not reveal your needs, do not rely too much on others. Now, when this pattern continues into adult relationships, a familiar cycle starts to develop. When emotional closeness increases, the avoidance system becomes activated. When the feeling of pressure grows stronger, the person creates distance. And when the relationship finally ends, something surprising often happens. The nervous system may experience relief, not necessarily happiness, but a decrease in the emotional weight they were carrying. And this is the part many people misunderstand. It may look like the avoidant person simply does not care, when in reality their system is returning to a state that feels familiar. Distance, independence, emotional control. That familiar feeling can create a sense of stability, not because it is deeply satisfying, but because it is something they recognize. But human beings are not built to live in complete emotional isolation forever. Even people with strong avoidant patterns still have a natural desire for connection and attachment. This creates an internal conflict between learned independence and the deeper human need for closeness. That tension can appear later as confusion, missing someone, emotional uncertainty, or mixed signals. Now, when someone reacts to avoidant rejection by becoming desperate, constantly chasing, or increasing emotional pressure, it often strengthens the avoidant person's belief that intimacy equals stress. It confirms the old emotional expectation they already carry. However, when the response changes, when someone steps back, becomes emotionally grounded, and stops reacting from fear or urgency, the entire emotional atmosphere begins to shift, not as a manipulation tactic, but as a genuine change in the way the relationship energy is experienced. At that point, something very subtle begins to happen. The avoidant person no longer feels chased, but they also no longer feels trapped by emotional demands. Instead, they experience something unfamiliar, space without pressure. And this combination can challenge their old expectations because it does not follow the pattern they have known before. Stay with me here, because this next part explains why so many relationship dynamics suddenly begin to change. In many real-life reconnection stories, this shift does not happen because of a clever technique. It happens because one person stops living from panic and starts returning to emotional balance. People often misunderstand this stage. They think it means, if I disappear, they will come back. But emotional systems do not work like a simple formula. They respond to stability, consistency, emotional tone, and the feeling of safety. Most importantly, they respond to whether the same old cycle is repeating or whether something completely different is beginning to take its place. When we look again at Jenny's experience, one detail becomes impossible to ignore. Her avoidant partner was expecting a familiar reaction after the breakup. In his mind, he likely believed she would respond the same way she had before. Anxious, overwhelmed, emotionally unstable, reaching out, asking questions, or trying to repair everything immediately. That was the version of her response he had already stored in his mind, but instead, he encountered something unexpected. She was calm, she was centered, she seemed stable and genuinely okay. And that difference created a quiet emotional disturbance in his expectations. Not something dramatic or obvious, but something deeper. The story he had created about her no longer matched what he was seeing in reality. This mismatch is often what begins the next stage of the avoidant cycle. It can be understood as a period where emotions begin to settle and the mind starts processing what changed. One common mistake is believing that once an avoidant person's perception changes, everything immediately transforms and they instantly return. But emotional patterns rarely work that way. After a breakup, there is usually a period where the avoidant person moves into solitude, not to punish anyone, not necessarily because of a calculated plan, but because their nervous system is trying to return to what feels manageable: independence, distance, emotional self-control. During this time, an internal conflict slowly starts growing. On one side, there is relief, freedom, and the feeling of escaping emotional intensity. On the other side, there is still a human need for connection that does not disappear simply because someone has learned to avoid it. This is the contradiction at the center of avoidant attachment. Two different systems operating at the same time, one shaped by past emotional experiences and another deeply connected to the basic human desire to bond. In everyday life, this stage often begins with silence. Jenny explained that after the breakup, her partner became completely distant. No messages, no conversations, no attempts to reconnect, just silence. From the outside, it can look like someone has moved on without caring, but often it is a form of emotional adjustment, and then something more subtle starts happening. Even without direct communication, awareness can remain. Curiosity does not always disappear when contact ends. Many people later realize that their avoidant partner was still paying attention from a distance, quietly observing, trying to understand why things felt different. At this point, the comfort of being apart begins mixing with uncertainty. Because solitude may feel safe, but it also creates new questions when the other person is no longer responding in the expected way. Slowly, the internal story begins to change. Not immediately toward reunion, but toward reflection. Thoughts begin appearing. Did I make the right choice? Did I misunderstand the situation? Why does this feel different from what I imagined? And this is where the next stage begins to develop. The movement toward reconnection does not usually start from outside pressure. It often begins from an internal conflict that can no longer be ignored. You can view this entire process as a movement between two emotional states. One where distance feels protective, and another where connection begins to feel important again. These two forces continue interacting depending on emotional safety, personal growth, and the way the relationship dynamic has changed.